We've had triumphs. We made some mistakes.
In 1992, rioting broke out in the streets of Los Angeles because a jury that included no blacks acquitted 4 white police officers in the beating of black motorist Rodney King. Los Angeles police were unable to restore order, so the governor mobilized the National Guard. That didn't work either, so the president sent in federal agents and troops. Whose job is it to maintain order when the local responses fail? In 1997, floodwaters devastated the Midwestern United States. Whose job is it to help local residents recover when natural disaster strikes and there's no money in the state treasury? The engine exhaust from automobiles on crowded freeways sends carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons into the air. This pollution must be controlled. Whose job is it to clean up? And whose job is it to pay for stricter vehicle emission testing? The national government? The states? Along the Rio Grande, illegal immigrants and their children flow into the United States. Whose job is it to pay for their health care and education? The United States government? The states? Such conflicts of interest abound because the United States has a federal system of government in which power is shared by a national government and 50 state governments. Add to those some 3,000 county governments, more than 19,000 municipal governments, 16,000 townships, 14,000 school districts, more than 33,000 special districts, and you wind up with actually 87,000 different governmental bodies. The system is known as federalism. The roots of federalism go back to 1787. The Articles of Confederation had been deliberately designed so each state retained its sovereignty and independence. But with no power to tax or regulate commerce, the national government was woefully weak. A compromise was struck. A new constitution distributed authority between the national government and the states. Certain powers were delegated to the national government. Other powers were to be shared. And any powers not delegated to the national government nor prohibited to the states were reserved to the states.
It is a unique development because, to some extent, every political society involves some type of power sharing because one person or one group is not able to dominate, but those are usually unstable. And this is the first system where there's an effort to share power territorially, cutting across communities of people who are not identified as particular classes or ethnic groups or religious groups. And so American federalism, in that respect, is a unique and original contribution of the American people to the art of democratic government. And we've survived for more than 200 years. So in that respect, the federal system was tremendously successful.
The new Constitution was tested when the case of McCulloch versus Maryland was argued in the United States Supreme Court in 1819. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled the Constitution gave Congress the power to incorporate a national bank because it was necessary and proper to carry out its delegated powers.
Let the end be legitimate. Let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consist with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional.
The Chief Justice argued the central government rests directly on the people. Others would argue the national government received all its power from the states, acting as organized sovereign capacities. That question was ultimately decided 40 years later at the cost of more than 600,000 lives.
After the Civil War, there was a concern, particularly in a part of the Supreme Court, to draw boundaries between the federal government and the states. So we probably have a pretty good balance of power up until the 1930s, when, with the inauguration of the New Deal, there's a considerable increase of federal power into the economy.
Give me back my job again.
And then beginning in the 1960s, there is a tremendous increase in federal power vis-a-vis the state and local governments. At this point, we were sort of at the high tide of federal power in our historical period, and I think that's why we're beginning to have a debate over devolution, or whether the federal government is growing too big, and whether the power should be restored to the states. I think the major challenges facing federalism in the United States is if we can maintain a constitutional balance of power between the states and the federal government, and particularly if the federal government, given the growth of federal power in recent years, can begin to refocus on its basic and primary functions laid out in the Constitution.
Should it be the states or the federal government that calls the shots? It's a battle that's as old as the country, and it's been fought in many arenas: the classroom, the workplace, and even on the highways.
Trucking, got my chips cashed in, keep trucking, like the doodah man together, more or less in line, just keep.
The interstate highway system is the backbone of ground transportation in the United States. 41,000 miles of four-lane highways connect all of its major cities on the North American continent. Truckers haul food, goods, and retail products to market. Motorists travel for business and for pleasure. But sometimes, pleasure can turn into tragedy.
Texas has more than 200,000 miles of roadway, and the Department of Public Safety has a highway patrol and several other uniformed services which patrol those 200,000 plus miles of highway. Primarily, we enforce state speed laws and other state laws.
The interstate system is a partnership between the national government and the states. 90% of the money to build and maintain it comes from Washington. The states pick up the remaining 10% of the tab. To qualify for national money, the states must adhere to rules and regulations set by Congress.
I think the setting of speed limits should be a state function. It is in all the states. And that's not just a states' rights issue, but at a local level, the state is more familiar with particular traffic conditions and roadway conditions. And there's some stretches of highway where a higher speed limit might be perfectly safe, whereas another section might not be. So it should be a state matter, and it is. Unless there is some other sort of national emergency where Congress would need to override the state enforcement.
Life in the fast lane, sure can make you lose your mind. Life in the fast lane.
Such an emergency occurred in 1974 when Arab countries imposed an oil embargo on the United States. To force motorists to increase gas mileage, Congress passed a law setting a national maximum speed limit of 55 miles per hour. Any state that wanted to keep receiving its share of highway construction funding would have to enforce the new speed limit.
That speed limit came to Texas the same way it came to all other 49 states. There were great lines at gasoline stations across the country because of a shortage of fuel. So Congress passed a law lowering the speed limit down to a mandatory 55 miles an hour.
What happened was a wonderful benefit that came out of the speed limit, and a year later, for the first time in history, there was a dramatic drop in highway fatalities and injuries. In fact, 9,000 fewer people died on our highways the year after that law took effect.
Not everyone was pleased. Many considered the lower limit a needless imposition on their rights. But like it or not, the 55 mile per hour limit was the law of the land until the oil began to flow again from the Middle East. In 1987, Congress increased the speed limit on some interstate and rural highways to 65 miles per hour. In late 1995, President Clinton signed a bill repealing the national maximum speed limit. In less than 6 months, 26 states hiked their speed limits, some up to 75 miles per hour. Montana decided the sky was the limit during the daytime. The Nevada legislature decided there would be no speed limit day or night.
In Texas, the speed limit reverted back to what it had been prior to the passage of that federal act. So in Texas, that speed limit, maximum speed limit, is 70 miles an hour. Statewide, we saw a 17.8% increase in traffic deaths in Texas in 1996 compared to 1995.
Every year, 42,000 people die on our highways and 3.5 million people are injured at an annual cost to society of $150 billion. This is the equivalent of a major airline crash each and every day on our highways. When you get on a plane in Washington, D.C., and you fly to Dallas, Texas, there's a lot of comfort in knowing that when you fly, there are very strict federal aviation rules which govern all aspects of that trip, including wearing your safety belt. And I think that the public would never tolerate, nor would Congress, allowing each state to set their own aviation rules.
Texas should have the option or the right to say this is good for Texas or this is not good for Texas, and make a decision based upon what's good for Texas. And people in New York and California and Iowa and North Carolina should be able to do the same thing.
Speed limits. Do they fall within the jurisdiction of the states or national government? A matter of public safety or individual freedom? Another battleground for turf in our federalist system of government.
It's hard to be sure about the numbers, but Justice Department officials say this is the deadliest U.S. bombing in 75 years.
It was the worst terrorist attack on United States soil, an expression of anger against the federal government. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City, April 19, 1995. Smoke billowing from an explosion that took 168 lives.
I thought we were having either an earthquake, a natural gas explosion, or the building had been hit by an airplane, a meteorite, or possibly a piece of space junk. Fortunately for me, the bomb material that was airborne went over the top of my head or went around me, but everything from the ceiling came in on me and covered me up to about here.
The victims were men, women, and children of Oklahoma, but among them were 8 federal law enforcement officers. And that made it a federal crime as well as a state crime.
Immediately following the bombing, within 1 hour, the chief of police, Sam Gonzalez, of Oklahoma City Police Department, and myself, I was in charge of the FBI for the state of Oklahoma. We got together with the chief of the fire department, Gary Mars, and Sam says, Bob, this is going to be the FBI's responsibility. We will be here to facilitate any needs that you have, but we understand that it is the federal government's role and that we will provide you whatever resources you need to solve this case.
Our crime scene collection inside of this area was done in joint teams. It consisted of some of the Oklahoma City police officers, some investigators from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, plus the federal law enforcement agencies. I don't think we really had any problems with rivalry between the state and local or the federal agencies.
90 minutes after the explosion, an Oklahoma highway patrolman arrested 27-year-old Timothy McVeigh for driving a vehicle without a license plate and carrying a firearm. He was turned over to federal agents when someone noticed he resembled one of the drawings of the bombing suspects.
Those were homicides against the law of the state of Oklahoma. They were also homicides because they were the killing of federal officials under the new federal death penalty statute. So you had a violation of state law, a violation of federal law, and because of the resources of the federal government, because it was an attack on a federal building, I think naturally the state officials deferred to the federal government to prosecute first.
Oklahoma County District Attorney Bob Macy wasn't satisfied to leave the case to his federal counterparts.
The federal government does not have a reputation for carrying out death sentences. It's very seldom the federal government has ever executed anyone. And so most of the people in Oklahoma want the case tried in Oklahoma. We have a death penalty statute here we know is valid. We've executed a number of people utilizing that statute. And so they want it brought back here. I've been their DA for 17 years. They have faith in me that I will try the case properly and not make any mistakes.
For 2 weeks, rescue workers working alongside federal, state, and local law enforcement officers combed what was left of the 9-story building. Working night and day, they searched for survivors and evidence to build a case against the perpetrators.
All of the evidence that we did collect was turned over to the FBI to be tagged by the FBI and sent to Washington for processing in their lab. One of our officers was instrumental very early on in finding a part to the Ryder truck that contained the number, and was instrumental in getting the truck identified and getting that part of the investigative procedure going.
As federal and local law enforcement officers continued the investigation, the state began to prepare its own case. The Oklahoma legislature appropriated $200,000 for the district attorney's office in connection with the bombing. Months passed. McVeigh and former Army buddy Terry Nichols were indicted on 1 count of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction to kill people and destroy federal property, 1 count of using a weapon of mass destruction that caused death and injury, 1 count of malicious destruction of federal property, and 8 counts of murdering federal law enforcement officers. Federal prosecutor Joseph Hartzler would seek the death penalty. Once the trial got underway, Hartzler presented his case, setting out to prove that McVeigh harbored a deep hatred of the federal government. Sitting in the courtroom, Oklahoma Assistant District Attorney Sandra Howell Elliott took copious notes.
If, as a result of this, there are further prosecutions that come from the state grand jury, so be it. The state of Oklahoma will be in a position to help in that investigation and prosecution. As I said, when something this tragic occurs, nobody could complain, I don't think. No thoughtful, sensitive person could complain, having as many people out there as can be investigating it, to make sure we got everybody who was responsible.
2 years after the crime, jurors found Timothy McVeigh guilty and sentenced him to die. They were convinced by the prosecution's case, which showed McVeigh was motivated by strong anti-government feelings following a raid by federal agents on the Branch Davidians. In the Oklahoma City bombing case, state and federal authorities cooperated in the rescue of victims, in the apprehension of suspects, and in their prosecution. But the interaction between the federal and state government didn't stop there. 2 years after the bombing, the federal building was gone, but neighboring buildings which suffered collateral damage still stood boarded up. Oklahoma City Mayor Ron Norick sought financial help from the federal government to rebuild and repair the private property.
Right now, we've received a grant from the federal government at $39 million, and we've expended approximately $23 million as of this day. We suspect that, based on our estimates, it will be somewhere around $60 million when it's over with. We have another request in for another $20-some million.
But those costs are dollars. Long after the cases are closed, long after the downtown area is rebuilt, the memories will remain. And while tragedy has a way of bringing people and even governments together at times, differences still remain and must be worked out, peacefully, within our system of federalism.
This land is your land. This land is my land. From California.
Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Lady Liberty was the first site many immigrants remembered as they waited on Ellis Island to become part of the melting pot. Today, immigrants still come in droves. Most arrive here at New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport. more than 700,000 foreigners a year arrive legally into the United States seeking a new lease on life. And here, halfway between JFK and downtown Manhattan, is where many immigrants first settle in New York, in the Elmhurst section of Queens. Here, low-rise apartments provide them their first home. On the streets, dozens of family-run restaurants serve the cuisine of various homelands: Vietnamese, Chinese, Colombian. Churches hold services in Indonesian, Korean, Russian. At Newtown High School, 3/4 of the student body are immigrants. Its hallways are an international crossroads for students from some 73 different countries, speaking dozens of languages. Here, bilingual classes are taught in Spanish, Korean, and Chinese. Outside of school, most need health care and social assistance. Many depend on welfare and food stamps. All this costs money, and that's where the rub begins.
The most expensive ones are things such as public education, K through 12. That comes to a little over $20 billion per annum. And then getting into things such as public higher education is about $6.4 billion. Social Security is a very large one, $25.5 billion. Medicaid, $14.5 billion. Medicare, $6 billion. Local government's a very big one, $20.3 billion per year. In 1996, it was calculated to be just slightly over $65 billion.
Even with the human services costs, some argue that immigrants contribute positively to the national economy.
A major recent study by the National Academy of Sciences found that immigrants impose a small, modest surplus, actually, annual surplus of about $7 to $10 billion a year. A lot of the studies make some important errors in the way they approach the problem, in that they don't take into account the indirect benefits of immigration. In other words, immigrants earn $85 billion a year in salaries and income. And there's a substantial amount of consumer spending that results from those comparatively high incomes, and that has economic effects that ripple through the economy that create jobs.
Immigrants pay sales tax, gasoline taxes, income tax, and Social Security tax. A portion of the rent pays for property taxes. But there are costs associated as well. Immigrant children need education, health care, and other services. Immigration falls within the purview of the national government, but states and local districts run the public schools. And the states are now given the latitude to administer welfare assistance. So who foots the bill? It's a classic dilemma in federalism. New York's Constitution requires the state to provide for the poor, in a sense, working as an effective federal mandate for the state to support the new costs of immigrants shifted onto its rolls.
This city has turned around in many, many respects in all 5 boroughs.
Mayor Rudolph Giuliani took the federal government to court.
I brought the lawsuit to protect legal immigrants because at the time, the federal government was cutting off all legal immigrants from benefits. They were cutting off legal immigrants who were on SSI, about 70,000 of them in the city of New York. They were cutting off legal immigrants from food stamps. And it was my sense that it deprived them of equal protection. If a legal immigrant pays taxes on the same basis as everyone else, a legal immigrant should be treated the same way for the purpose of benefits.
And then there is the problem of those who are in the United States illegally. Many people of all nationalities arrive in the United States on a visa and then overstay their time and remain illegally. There are also those who enter illegally in the first place. Because of the large border with Mexico, this creates a particular issue for certain states.
I think it's very important that we realize that some of the border states do have extra problems because we have people that have come into our country and they have babies sometimes, which creates American citizens. So they have certain rights which can never be abridged. But I also think it's important that we keep our sovereign borders so that people will not come into our country illegally and expect to to be then able to take from our taxpayers, the hardworking taxpayers of our country.
Texas, California, Florida, Arizona, and New Mexico sued the federal government for failing to seal the borders properly and causing them burdens. Congress responded to the problem with a new immigration bill doubling the size of the Border Patrol by adding 700 new agents in 1996, plus 1,000 more annually until the year 2000. Despite that effort, illegal immigrants continue to enter the United States.
The states are bearing all the costs of education, whereas the federal government, which is responsible for patrolling the borders and certainly in charge of legal immigration, are the ones who are causing states like California indirectly to have these large overloads in cost.
This land is your land. This land.
The federal government, in a sense, if you talk about incentives and economics, doesn't have nearly the incentive to really do much about the immigration problem compared to state and local governments.
Immigration made the United States what it is, and it continues to create new challenges for that delicate balance of power that we call federalism. Federalism has many facets, whether it's speed limits, law enforcement and rescue in the face of national tragedy, or dealing with immigrants. Political differences can often become a factor. Conflict, cooperation, and complexity mark the often delicate coexistence between the national government in Washington, the states, and local governmental bodies. And the future will bring new challenges.
Globalization in the 21st century is going to present challenges to all federal systems in the world, and also opportunities. State and local governments are probably in the best position to compete in the global economy because they can market their particular economies and they reflect the diversity of a large society like the United States.
We have a unique opportunity and a common responsibility, which is to take action together.
All of us recognize that if we're going to be successful, we have to work together, that we do have a symbiotic relationship with each other.
Solutions aren't always the same, yet the system continually seems to adapt, tried and tested, flexible, not finite. Federalism forges its way into the future.